You're wondering who I am. I'm Robert Buckland, and I'm chair of the Levelling Up Commission. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much indeed for registering your interest and logging on to this afternoon's session. This is our very first Levelling Up Commission inquiry session entitled System Change and Devolution. We're going to have three different inquiry panels. And let me just at this outset talk about the mission that we have. I'm delighted to have been asked to chair this commission. We are going to produce a number of chapters which will create a book that is designed to be published later in the year to fill in the gaps between national aspiration that you all know is in the Levelling Up white paper, which I have before me, and the reality of local delivery. And the only way it's going to happen is if people on this call and elsewhere are equipped with and knowledgeable of and able to carry out the aspects of this mission that are so important. I think that the government's commitment to an annual review praising progress is very important, but we need to make sure that the actual plans, the implementation plans, work at a local level. And in the spirit that Levelling Up is to be done with and by and about localities rather than for or to them, I think conversations like the one we are about to have this afternoon are invaluable. And our four simple aims, the Commission's four simple aims are these. First of all, to support and encourage the formation of Levelling Up implementation plans with local and regional government. That's you. 2, to assess the progress of those plans with annual updates. 3, to align regional economic priorities with those national strategies. And finally, to engage with business, civil society, NHS trusts and other commissioning bodies in the Levelling Up objectives. Now, this afternoon, we're going to be in particular focusing upon local and regional government and system change. And the first panel that we have will be talking about and asking the question, which London-style powers will benefit communities? And who better, I think, to have on our panel? And first of all, Councillor Susan Hall, Assembly Member and leader of the Greater London Assembly Conservatives. A warm welcome to you, Susan. And of course, Professor Tony Travers, visiting professor in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics, whose reputation precedes him. It's a pleasure to have you both with us. We're just waiting for our good friend Ben Houchen, the Mayor of Teesside. He's just running a little late, but I'm sure will be with us very soon. And I'm going to open the discussion by, first of all, asking Susan and then Tony, just for a short series of remarks as to their assessment of the question, and then we can open it up for questions. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for inviting me to form part of this panel today. And I'm sure you're thrilled with the amount of people that are on it. I'm certainly pleased to see so many people. As you've also mentioned, I'm the leader of the Conservative group on the London Assembly, which is the body that's responsible for scrutinising the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and holding him to account. I'm here very much with a London hat on, so I'll start by saying that I really welcome assurances from the government that London, with the Levelling Up white paper, calls its complex economic geography and socio-economic spectrum, can still benefit from the Levelling Up agenda. Sadiq Khan makes very much of the fact that he assumes that the government will be levelling London down. I mean, inevitably, I think there are some areas where London is seen as an outlier, mostly for the good, I must say. And indeed, we have a selection here, talking about London-style powers as it's something to be emulated. The white paper uses the phrase London style, X, Y, Z over and over again. And there are areas this pays dividends, the joined up nature of our transport system, certainly our broader general economic strengths, our pay, our prosperity, and opportunities and skills mustn't be overlooked. But London does have challenges. Unemployment is higher, it's more expensive to live in, to the point at which many no longer dream of being able to afford to live here. significant areas of deprivation is Tower Hamlets, Barking and Dagenham, and there are others, as well as pockets, and we mustn't forget this, in otherwise affluent areas such as Kensington and Chelsea, which lots of people, unless you live here, don't actually realise that. And they hide what are very real challenges in those areas. And that's why I'm concerned that levelling up is about closing the gap between better performing areas and others, not levelling down. Because if you level down those areas which are fortunate but have complex but often hidden needs, they will suffer significantly. In terms of governance structures, sorry, we have, I think the Merrell model has shown its real merits, but it does have real limitations. And the same could be said of the scrutiny model we have in terms of the Assembly. The London Mayoralty is a very powerful position, as you all know. It's got a £19 billion budget. He's got his own transport system, significant control over housing provision and planning and regeneration across the city. And let's not forget, he's serving as the Police and Crime Commissioner too, something that the current incumbent doesn't like to be reminded of specifically at the moment. As you know, they're in special measures, and that is. But I'm not someone who has much time for the current mayor's endless calls for more of this, more of that. He always wants more money from the government. But I would urge the government to look at the means by which we on the Assembly can hold the mayor to account. We do have certain powers of summons and regularly grill the mayor and his deputies, but there is something missing. We do need a proper, true check and balance system. We can amend his budget in theory, but the electoral system always delivers the mayor a blocking minority of Assembly members to prevent this from happening. And in 22 years, we've never done it. We're also lacking major powers, such as the ability to call in decisions the mayor can just make on a daily basis, spending millions of pounds, and there's no real mechanism to pause or properly assess or scrutinise this in detail until after the fact. So I really welcome the government looking into potentially expanding Merrell systems and the importance of accountability frameworks in doing as such. But there are lessons, good and bad, that certainly can be learned from London in that respect. So thank you very much, and I do look forward to the discussion to come.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Susan. And I think it was good to have a dose of realism there about some of the limitations that you experience as a member of the London Assembly. I'm now going to go to Tony Travis, but before I do that, I'll extend a warm welcome to Ben Houchen, the Mayor of Teesside. It's great to have you on this call, Ben. I'm going to ask Tony to speak to us next, and then I'll come to you for some opening remarks before opening the matter up to questions. So I'll hand over to Professor Tony Travis.
See what all the benefits, and there are many, of returning to real life have done. I've now forgotten how to use Zoom. Right, I was saying I'd like to thank Sir Robert for inviting me. Good to hear Susan, and good to see everybody here today. Right, what I want to do is to try to put the London reforms in a kind of British constitutional context for a moment, because they came about in 2000 to some extent as a product of the Labour opposition, as it had been until 1997's policy evolution, particularly under Tony Blair, following the abolition of the Greater London Council in 1986. So there was a gap, no citywide government in London where there had previously been that. Now, that's history, just to park all of that. But intriguingly, the Blair government decided to introduce this American idea of a directly elected mayor, not something we had seen previously in the United Kingdom. So the idea of directly elected individuals who combined executive and representative functions, very common in America and a number of other places around the world, France, for example, not so true, not so usual. In fact, until that point, uniquely never the case in the United Kingdom. And of course, in the best traditions of this, and Susan has referred to this, the way it was set up is in a classic British hybrid. So the mayor is, though it's doesn't have a massive amount of power, is directly elected and within their own world very powerful, whereas the Assembly is a sort of hybrid between an American city council, or indeed Congress, or a state governor, state legislature, and a select committee. It's an almost perfect hybrid of the two, and as a result, the assembly is more than exists in other combined authorities, but much less powerful than it would be if it were an American city government with legislative powers over the mayor, who is the executive. So I know it's a bit formal, but bear with me. Roll forward to the creation of other combined authorities, and then with mayors added to them, particularly by the Cameron-Osborne government in the period from 2000 to 2010. So combined authorities under at the end of the Labour government, then mayors added to that outside London, and we have a new model emerging of not a sort of separate series of boroughs and an elected mayor, but a combined authority consisting of all the local authorities, and then a mayor added to that as a member of the combined authority. I think I've got that right. The mayor of Tees Valley will correct me if I've got that wrong. And that model is somewhat different again. Not quite answering your question. All I'm saying is that in a very British way, we've evolved this far. Other combined authorities with mayors have come along, and the government is now moving towards the possibility of more county-based unitaries, some of them with mayors or governors and so on. It's all a very, very British way of doing things. The powers given to the Mayor of London, predominantly transport, fire and emergencies, policing in a sort of indirect way, shared with the Home Secretary, and strategic planning. So London boroughs have to make their plans within the strategic or London plan set by the Mayor of London, which is subject to a sort of investigatory and legislative process, gives the Mayor a significant amount of authority via budget setting and so on over those services. Some, but not all of that, has been adopted in other mayoral models, and other mayors, and we'll hear from, I'm sure, from Ben Houchen about this, have a sort of slightly different remit for good reasons. So I think what we're seeing here in a very British way, and I'll stop in a moment, is an evolution within England from a London model to a model in other city regions and now into counties and county regions, which is different from place to place. But I think the underlying question I would ask is, are these service responsibilities and the capacity to fund them sufficient for the mayor, overseen by the assembly or elsewhere by different oversight mechanisms, sufficient to do what they are supposed to be doing, given Parliament's passing of laws in the first place? Sorry, that was rather long-winded. Sorry about that.
No, Tony, thank you very much. I think it's good to remind us all that, you know, in many respects, with regard to modern English devolution, London's the daddy of them all, beginning in 2000. And the common thread that we've established thus far is this question of accountability and oversight. Is it sufficient? Susan is of the view that it isn't. But it'll be great now to hear from somebody who is not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk as an elected mayor in his second term now of office as the mayor of Teesside. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Ben Houchen. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, sir, and apologies for my tardiness. A meeting ran over slightly, so apologies for that. I think following on from Tony, I think it's helpful if I just kind of set out exactly what a combined authority looks like in the Tees Valley, because again, it's right to say that even within the combined authority models that followed London, each one is ever so slightly different. So if you go back to 2017, when the first round of English devolution happened post-London, you actually had a master deal that was negotiated between George Osborne and the leaders at Manchester and the Greater Manchester Authority that was kind of seen as the template for what devolution across the rest of England could look like. And if you actually look towards that deal, that encapsulates all of the powers under the current legislation that allow for devolution within England. When you look at others across the area, whether that was the west of England, whether it was the West Midlands or indeed the Tees Valley, you found that others, for whatever reason, didn't have quite all of the powers of Manchester or Greater Manchester, but we had a selection of different ones. And I would probably say at the time in 2017, the Tees Valley was probably the one with the least number of powers. One, I think because of its scale as a relatively small combined authority compared to the larger ones, but also secondly, by design of geography and government policy, there were things that we just couldn't take on. So the obvious ones that were excluded from the Tees Valley that Manchester had was the powers of the PCC, in effect, that then also encapsulated fire, that is now being pushed as UK government policy, that where there is a coterminous combined authority area with a PCC, then the mayor will in effect become the PCC, and that will be amalgamated, not dissimilar to London. But I also think there is a question mark over whether that includes fire, and that still includes this separate process that PCCs are having to go through as to whether they take fire or not. We then took the usual stuff that we have in combined authority areas in England at the moment. So we are the wider transport authority, which is easy to say but difficult to define, because we don't have responsibility over maintaining local roads. That still sits with the local councils. We don't fill in potholes. We don't manage pinch points at roundabouts. And at the same time, at the other end of the scale, for example, in the Tees Valley, we've got the A19, which is one of the main arterial roads from Yorkshire up to the wider northeast. And that's part of the strategic road network, which is Highways England's responsibility, or English Highways, or whatever they're calling themselves now. So again, there is with devolution at the minute, there are a lot of grey areas about who's responsible for what, and how you still have to very heavily interact with those other organisations. The other couple of things that I think are interesting that tend to not get talked about too much, albeit from a devolved mayor's point of view, I think it's fair to say that every mayor in England is united on the point around skills devolution. So I'm not sure of the London situation, but I know the rest of the combined authorities have responsibility for managing the budget for the adult education budget that's been devolved down to each area. We want to go further in that. I think it's a fair statement that we all want to go further to post-16 budgeting, because bringing the economy closer together with skills on a local economy basis is actually quite important. And one of the things that we did historically as part of the EU, we were the intermediate body for a lot of the funding that used to come through the European Union. Now that is continued, because it looks like, well, it is happening. We are now also responsible as the intermediate body for the shared prosperity funding as well, which again might come on to the wider session, but seems to be not formally but informally changing the scope of what a combined authority is there to do, because a lot of the is quite community and place-based around certain community interventions, whereas combined authorities so far have been largely focused around infrastructure and business support, whether that is transport, whether that's business investment, whether that's that kind of thing. We haven't really got in the way of what local authorities have done, and SPS seems to be changing that ever so slightly. And then very quickly, again, not to take up too much time because the discussion is much more interesting. The structure of the combined authorities, separate from London, I can tell you, is we have a combined authority cabinet. So I chair that as the mayor, and then I have the other local authority leaders that are in effect my cabinet members. There's a really interesting model that I think the combined authorities outside of London have, which is we have the thing that the mayor has is a negative power. It's a power of veto. So I can't approve anything through my combined authority without getting the support of the majority of the cabinet. And in the Tees Valley, that's a mixture of independent Labour and Conservative leaders. At the same time, the other leaders can't club together and do something without my permission, because I have a power of veto. So it doesn't matter if they all vote for something, it doesn't happen unless it has the support of the mayor. And that creates an interesting dynamic that it isn't a positive power, but it does require a consensus to be able to push things through. Again, apologies, Chairman, but I'm sure we'll come on to some detail in the session about different types of decisions require different levels of support. So something called investment plan decisions require unanimity from everybody, including the mayor, to agree it to get through. That's often around what the combined authorities have as a budget, but we don't really have a budget in the local authority sense. And then there are general decisions, which are just majority decisions as well. But again, different to London, we do have an overview and scrutiny committee that can call in decisions, both of the mayor, where I have mayoral powers that does not require the permission of the combined authority cabinet, but they can also call in decisions of the combined authority cabinet as well. So again, that's a very quick overview that is ever so slightly different from London. So there are some more checks and balances than there have been before. And again, I think the only other thing that we got in 2017 that no other devolution deal did get, but I believe this has now been rolled out to everyone, was the ability to establish mayoral development corporations as well, which is a whole different level of governance, which is really interesting actually. And we've obviously got the Teesside Freeport and Teesworks, which is doing very well as a development corporation, which is a power of the mayor, not a power of the combined authority to set up. And from what I can see, there is no ability for the government to not set one up. There is a process to go through with central government to set one up, but there is a really interesting model where a mayor can set up a development corporation, appoint the board, So the mayor has the power to appoint the board, and there is no limit or restriction on the constitution or makeup of that board. And again, I'm happy to go into some detail about our development corporation that we've got set up, should that be of any interest to people. So I could go on for a long time, Chairman, but I'm sure we'll go into the details through the question and answer session.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben, and thanks to the panel for opening the discussion up. We've got a good 20 minutes or so to get through some of the pre-submitted questions. I'm not going to invite each of the questioners to deliver their question. What I'm going to try and do my best to do is to summarize some of the themes that we are seeing. And I think starting really with powers, I think the themes from all the questioners, and we've got questioners from as varied authorities as Buckland over in Norfolk, Teesside up in Greater Manchester, and the Outer London Borough of Enfield, for example, plus the new authority of Northamptonshire. What really, I think, ties in all these questions in terms of a thread is this. London's all very well, but how do you translate the use of those powers into, say, a rural or even a semi-urban type of authority, which of course feels and looks a long way away from the metropolitan mass of London? And are we making the assumption that London style powers are what we want? Are we making the right assumption? Are we looking at it through the right lens? And if not, should we in fact just assume that because of issues like transport links, which one of the questioners raised, that there are fundamental differences, and that we are frankly comparing apples with pears when it comes to London versus the rest of the country? I don't know who'd like on the panel to have a go at that, but I'd love to hear more about your views as to direct comparisons and whether this is a worthwhile exercise in the first place. And Ben's got his hand up first, so I'll go to Ben first and then I'll come to the other panel members.
Thank you. I jumped in because this is a real topic of interest to me. So we've been doing quite a lot of work to see how this works. Now, the Tees Valley is really interesting in this remit because we're not a city. We don't have a city in the Tees Valley in the 5 local authority areas that I cover. We are a series of, in effect, 5 relatively small, medium-sized towns. But we also have a large rural area in places like East Cleveland, which is actually has much more connection with North Yorkshire than it does with the Tees Valley, but is plagued by a huge amount of rural poverty, which I'm sure some people in the meeting will recognise. It works very well in the Tees Valley, so it doesn't have to be around large cities, metropolitan areas. I think there is a question mark which we can come on to on rural areas, because that's more about the structure with which government is looking to implement future devolution deals. But the two things, and I'm increasingly convinced, having talked about this for a couple of years now, the two things you need for a sustainable devolution deal to work in whatever size is you need a single community and you need a single economy. Now, you can look around the deals that have been delivered, and that works across the patch, whether that's cities or whether that is in places like the Tees Valley where we have towns. And the reason for that is important. One, if we're investing, and I'll use Tees Valley as an example, if we're investing 130, 150 million pounds in redeveloping Darlington train station on the west end of the Tees Valley, which is 40, 50 miles away from Redcar in East Cleveland, the first thing you're going to get if you're not a single community is people in Redcar and East Cleveland saying, well, where's our money? Whereas that doesn't happen in the Tees Valley because people see that as an investment in them. It's part of their community, and that's important. It's one of the reasons the One Yorkshire deal was never going to work, because if you did the same thing, say, in Northallerton, the people of Bradford and Rotherham would be saying, well, where's our money for our station? Because they don't necessarily identify as the same community. And the second thing that hangs it together is the same economy. And those two, some things are sometimes interlinked. But if you're investing like we are, for example, in the old steelworks, people recognise that the commuter patterns, the traveller flow about where people live and people work, it is an encapsulated economy. Now, there is always bleed over into North Yorkshire and Durham in places like the Tees Valley, but by and large, it's a single economy. And so again, if you translate that to North Yorkshire and the wider One Yorkshire deal that didn't work, again, you can see why that doesn't work, because rural North Yorkshire has little in common really with the economy of Sheffield or Leeds and elsewhere. And that's why those things often collapse. So I always say to people, if you're looking at devolution, it's not necessarily, should it just be a county? Should it be towns? Should it be cities? It's these two questions that need to be answered. Otherwise, it can never hang together and it can't be a productive organisation.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ben. That was a really useful insight. Tony, do you want to come in on this point? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, as with everything, we wouldn't have begun here. And the truth is that because of the very different form of devolution to Scotland, Wales, and in a different way to Northern Ireland, and then the failed attempt to introduce a region in the northeast, we've ended up with a very organic way, nothing wrong with organic, of developing effectively city regions and other forms of new government in England. And nothing wrong with that, save for the fact there is this terrible over time. If you look back to history of local government reform through Parliament, every now and again, Parliament feels the need to make everything the same across the whole of England, all across the whole of Scotland. So we're a long way from that, but you can see some of the outer edges of this, which is, you know, do we need unitaries everywhere in order to create combined authorities? And the difficulty, if there aren't unitaries in all over an area, is that you risk having a combined authority and a county and districts and perhaps parishes besides, which does look about quite a lot of elections and quite a lot of government. So, I mean, personally, as I was saying, I'm rather not enthusiastic about reorganizations because they're often displacement activity. But so the question, and the great thing about combined authorities is that they allow a new form of government over an area, as elegantly just described, without needing to reorganize the whole of local government to do it, which I think is a prize, aiming off from my own worry about perhaps a bit too much governance here and there. I think there will be an issue at some point, however, which is if it's very different from place to place throughout England by 2030, not to choose a year at random, will that be seen as in need of tidying up? But only parliamentarians can decide that in the government of the day. The other thought I would add is that, you know, England is always, as indeed are Wales and Scotland, to some extent, all of these things are dictated by industrial history. You know, the layout of the population of England is not quite as Napoleonic as the layout of the population in France. We are where we are. The Industrial Revolution did what it did, which is fine. And thus the discussion Ben Houchen's just had about creating an area that makes sense. The only other thing I'd add is I think the choice of name, mayor versus governor, ought to be, or anything else, frankly, ought to be up to the areas concerned. I think the word mayor is a bit urban sounding, sounds okay in London and Greater Manchester. Ben Houchen is mayor of Tees Valley, he'll have his own view on this, but I do think allowing choice for more rural areas to come up with different terms of art to describe their area-wide elected representative, if they have one, is definitely one to be prized. So I think the government's on the right track about that.
Well, thank you, Tony, and indeed, your point about the sort of overarching combined authorities is one I think the government does adopt in its white paper. I mean, personally speaking, I'm a bit more of a Heseltine on this. I would have started from a very different place and tried to redraw the map, but that's, you know, I think at the moment not necessarily realistic. I want to bring Susan in because in particular, Susan, I think, started this discussion off with some interesting reflections about accountability. And it does seem to me that that is one of the most important questions we have here. You know, you can take different types of authority, cabinet, leader model, committee model, but the accountability is at the heart of all of this. And I think, you know, Susan's insights about that would be very, very useful, and particularly the transferability of the powers that there are in the metropolis as opposed to the rest of the country. Susan.
Well, if I can start by saying, Robert, that I don't think you can transfer one system from one place to another. You've got to assess need. I mean, in my little talk to start with, I explained that even within London, you've got different needs within London, and central London is certainly different from outer London. So I'll say that. And you were talking in your introduction about the infrastructure around transport. Even in London, the London buses lose £800 million a year. So if you're going to put in major infrastructure, you have to carefully analyse the different areas it's going into. With regard to accountability, I'm afraid our our mayor's got such strong powers. He's got a £19 billion budget, and there's very little we can do about it, because the only real thing that we could do is to say no to his budget. Unfortunately, he has the Labour Assembly members under his thumb, and they won't vote against it. And because of the way he's elected in, you're very unlikely to have a majority of the other parties on the Assembly. So unless you get a very strong group of Labour Assembly members, they're just not going to vote against his budget. So we have a problem.
Well, thank you, Susan. And that does beg, I think, a lot of questions in our minds as to, what could be a better model that prevents the, the sort of one-party state, if you like, and the lack of accountability that can then lead to poor outcomes, because I think one of the strands in the white paper is this need for accountability, so that programmes which will often last much beyond a council or a parliamentary term are effectively scrutinised and monitored, and deliver what they say they're going to deliver. And I'm looking at the chat here, and I'm taking a great interest in the variety of different views. We've already got a message from a Havering councillor about just being careful what we wish for with regard to, as you say, the inner and outer London tension, and how, from his perspective, they feel marginalised, frankly. And I think Liam Billington's question, which Ben has highlighted on the chat about accountability in Greater Manchester, is an interesting parallel here, Susan, because Liam's saying that scrutiny is not working. It requires 2/3 of members to be present. Labour members don't turn up, so the meetings aren't quorate. And Andy Burnham was allowed to pass a 28% precept increase without any scrutiny. And therefore, you've already got in other combined authorities this sort of lack of accountability, which I think the consensus of certainly on contributors on this call in the questions is very much against. So just coming on then to some of the other themes that we're picking up, and in the last 10 minutes or so that we have of this part of the session, I thought perhaps it would be worthwhile just looking perhaps more generally in terms of some of the questioners asking from their perspective, quite naturally, a Southeast perspective, for example, saying, levelling up via local authorities, what does it actually mean? Does it actually mean that the Southeast is not part of this? And general questions about what does a good, successful levelling up operation look like? And in fact, that's asked by my great friend Matty Courtliff, who's a cabinet member in Swindon Borough Council. And I just wonder whether anybody would like to have a stab at that general approach, and also in the context of what a successful levelling up looks like, but what negotiations between the department itself and the local and regional government in question should be looking like. Do we think they are in a great place? Do we think they need to improve? And how do we see, what suggestions do we have to improve that link between central and local government? Who'd like to kick off on that from the panel? I've got Tony's hand up. Tony, if you go.
Okay, well, I mean, clearly there are elements of what levelling up. I mean, levelling up, we can all talk about what it means till the cows come home, but just assume there are undoubtedly parts of the United Kingdom, though they're not all in one place, which have suffered from decades of deindustrialization without enough reinvestment in their economies to allow everybody who wants them in the area to have a reasonable opportunity of a well-paid job and progress. So if I can kind of have my own sort of implied definition of what it means, but that will vary from place to place. But without question, there are places in the southeast of England or the southwest of England, which doesn't get much attention in public policy. Southwest is hardly ever discussed in public policy, which will have areas that have exactly the same needs. And I always thought myself, levelling up is more about individuals or should be more about individuals and households, well, not more than, but at least as much as some of the area-wide regeneration that is also required. So it needs to be two things at once, and different policies. For example, policies to do with, and this was mentioned earlier, adult education, post-school education, and the way it works for people in different circumstances needs a massive amount of attention. So I'd just add that. The other thing, while I'm speaking, and I'll be quiet, is that I do think the one element of the levelling up policy as it's currently operated, which involves lots of pots of tiny cash that councils have to bid for, is definitely not an efficient way of doing things, because you end up with teams of civil servants with the best will in the world in SW1, you know, near where you're sitting at the moment, Sir Robert, you know, trying to assess whether, you know, a canal side improvement in Bassett Law is more or less important than improving the lights on the prom in Blackpool. That can't make sense. So I think the more resources are handed over to combined authorities and their mayors to decide locally how they spend them, and I do think it will help levelling up. I strongly believe that devolution will lead to not just levelling up, but greater trust in government. So there are good reasons for doing it.
Well, thank you, Tony. And, you know, I think you posit some really interesting challenges there. And it sort of chimes, I think, with some of the comments that I'm seeing on the chat about accountability. I think great comment from Anthony Barnes, who's just gone back into opposition and seeing from his own perspective the importance of the need for effective scrutiny. And then Jay McBean's point about actually scrutiny making government better, and I entirely agree with that. You know, I'm afraid the poorest decisions made in government, in my experience, are ones that have been not properly tested, either internally and certainly not externally. I was going to bring in another member of the panel. Does anybody want to come in? Yes, Susan.
Well, just very briefly, I mean, I think whatever we must do, it's got to have public support. Nobody must feel that they've been levelled down, and that's something Mayor Khan is going on about the whole time. I think it's got to mean something to everyone, and we've got to bear in mind that there's pockets of deprivation in all over the country, and we've got to be mindful of that and make sure that that's where we focus various things that are required, and it's different for every area. Everybody on this call will have something unique to their own areas, and the councillors, etc., are the ones that know about this. So we mustn't always generalise that what we think is good for everybody else everywhere else in the country is, because it's local people that will know what's good for their area, and how to spread the message that we are levelling up.
Thanks. Thank you. I don't know whether, Ben, you want to come in here briefly?
Yeah, just quickly, I think, I mean, I take a very, very narrow view of what levelling up is, because, you know, take the view of the Tees Valley, an average wage of £24,000 per annum compared to national average of just over 31. That might have gone up ever so slightly now. Average higher unemployment compared to national average. I think some bridging those gaps at the start of devolution. It gets quite complex, but actually there are some quite low-hanging fruits for areas like Teesside. And I also take the point that levelling up actually emerged out of the Northern Powerhouse. So often it gets seen as a northern thing, when actually I think it's becoming more and more of a cities and everywhere else type of thing. Now, cities have their own challenges, but actually if you look at Teesside and Cornwall, for instance, we both have equal levels of deprivation as tier 1 support areas, but actually have very different economies, right? So I don't necessarily think it's a north and south thing. I think devolution works in combined authority areas because it does start to give that level of autonomy. So again, just to be clear with everybody, if you have a devolution deal, the combined authority gets a guaranteed amount of money every year for 30 years from government. That means that that is devolved completely to the combined authority, or in some instances, there is some ability for the mayor to spend that money or some of that money themselves. But I've just already explained the governance model about how there are checks and balances on that. But you also then get borrowing powers as well. And interestingly, the government are about to change the rules on this, we understand, because we have a borrowing limit at the minute. I think for the Tees Valley, it works out about £800 million. So using that guaranteed income over 30 years, you can front load that by borrowing against it to be able to front load investment. Or if you want to be really, really conservative, you can just sit there and spend the money you get every year from government. But obviously there are issues around inflation, depreciation, getting value for money. The government are about to change that in that they're going to get rid of the borrowing cap. And that's important because it allows, in effect, combined authorities to act in the same way as local authorities and borrow as much as they like on the basis that there is a prudent borrowing case and there is the ability to repay. So that could unleash some really interesting opportunities, but that is all ultimately left to the combined authorities to decide. Now, you can argue there should be some more money or some more flexibility, but there is some there. There is a hook back into government, though. So ultimately, all combined authorities have an annual and a 5-year review with central government, and that involves what do look now, but also the Treasury, to make sure that we're not spending all of our money on sweets, that actually there is a return to the taxpayer and that there is kind of like a positive business case. But ultimately, that's for us to justify, and they can't stop us from making the investment. It's just you've got to take a blended view in the round. And then the other thing, which is a very, very final thing, but it's really important because the government are clearly buying into this as a policy, as is the civil service, because they increasingly, where they work with good combined authorities, there is this idea I see of earned autonomy. So the departments also, once you show that you are good at something, they give you more and they give you more flexibility and they almost invite you into the fold. Where it isn't working, they still treat you as quite arm's length. But if you look at what the Treasury have done around things like the Transforming Cities Fund, they turned around a £4.8 billion pot, I think it was. Half of that was just allocated to combined authorities on a per head of population basis. The other, everywhere else, had to bid in for that and compete with everyone. So the government do see combined authorities as a delivery mechanism for them, and they are getting priority, and they are getting more autonomy to be able to deliver those things with pots of money that you don't have to bid where other areas do have to bid.
Ben, that's a really helpful progress report on how trust between, proven regional authorities and combined authorities can actually increase the trust that government shows in you and in other bodies. And I think the point you make about borrowing, the Treasury is always very nervous about adding to the overall borrowing amount. This is an interesting development. I see Anthony's point about having local tax powers. That all leads on, doesn't it, to actually having a mature discussion about this. Up until now, Treasury has always been very hostile, but I think inevitably, these conversations are going to increase, and especially with increased borrowing powers, people are entitled to ask about revenue as well. I think, Ben, you wanted to come in briefly?
I just wanted to supplement that extremely important point, because this is now, you can see where government and in particular Treasury are moving to. So, and this is where devolution isn't a one size fits all. So we're negotiating at the minute something called the Sustainable Transport Settlement, which is a huge amount of money from government being given to devolved combined authority areas. But government are now saying there needs to be a contribution from the local area to try and take on more responsibility. You need to start being a bit more grown up rather than just having money that you can spend, which is fine. The issue with that is that's fine for Greater Manchester, who can raise revenue against the Metro, and Liverpool can do it against whatever it is they have. They've got a Metro as well, all that kind of stuff. If you look at Teesside though, which is probably similar to a lot of people on this call, we don't own any transport infrastructure. We have no revenue powers, and the only thing we can do is therefore raise taxes against the precepts that we have. Now that seems perverse to me, because you're actually punishing those areas that have been left behind for a long time by saying, we'll give you some more money, but you've got to tax people more because you didn't do as well as, for example, London did, where they got loads of grants and therefore don't need to raise taxes as much. Not that London doesn't raise taxes, but you can see there's a perversion in asking areas that have been left behind to fund the levelling up that government is saying that they should be helping to fund and provide support for.
Well, Ben, that's a really helpful point on which, just to bring things to a conclusion, I'm going to indulge myself very briefly. I see my good friend Matty Courtliff, Cabinet Member in Swindon, has got his hand up. Matty, do you want to come in and just make a final comment before I move on to the next panel? Matty.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. So I follow on from what Tony was saying. I think levelling up is about, for me, it's all about opportunity and the opportunity that people have, whether you're from a post-industrial town in Lancashire, rural part of Cornwall, or a hamlet in the southeast. To me, it's about ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to succeed. And in a local government context, that is, central government being a bit more hands-off, trusting those of us who are elected and know our residents best to respond to their needs with the right kind of power and resources to be able to do so. I think it needs to go beyond just funding pots of money, etc. And really, if you're giving us extra responsibility, give us the extra powers, such as over business rates, as Ben was saying. We need to be able to explore ways of raising revenue within our own individual contexts, to be able to provide for our own unique places, because there is no one size fits all for levelling up in my mind.
Yes, well, thank you. And I'm going to allow one last hand up. I see Anthony Barnes has been making some very interesting interventions in this. Anthony, do you want to just briefly come in with your comments?
Yes, I think 3 comments. First of all, we need seriously to review the history of regional policy to find out why it didn't work. We've been trying it since the 1920s. And we seem not even to have any serious histories of it in the last 20 years. Second, I think effective transport links. The reason why London is dominant is it actually dominates the transport system as well as the financial system. And the other thing is we do need to really look at local taxation again and give local control of taxation, get it away from the Treasury. Now, that will need to be rule bound, and I would certainly advocate the structure of income tax staying national. But I see absolutely no reason why the level of income tax, the basic rate, and the product shouldn't service local services and some of the National Health Service. And let government actually exist out of business taxation and indirect taxation. I think that's well worth looking at as a model, which will really free up local government to do what it does. Frankly, I go back to the 1960s when local government actually ran the show and the central government ran the remnants of the British Empire. And it worked a damn sight better than it does today.
Well, thank you for that very thought-provoking point. There's a counter opinion. I mean, Liam Billington has kicked back against the idea of increasing borrowing powers because a natural concern that we end up overburdening the poor taxpayer. But ultimately this conversation has moved in the direction I thought that it should go, which is away from just talking about structure to talking about accountability. And inevitably with accountability that means money and how it is raised and who raises it and who is responsible for it. So can I, in winding up this panel slightly over time, thank our panelists for their excellent contributions, thank everybody for their questions, and we'll say goodbye to our first panel. And now I'm sure, thanks to my friends at Cllr, we will seamlessly move on to the second panel, which is a 40-minute panel discussing the tiers and responsibilities of local government. And I think as we're coming on, I hope that we have online our 4 panelists, and they are as follows. They're Tim Bowles, who was until last year the first mayor of the West of England Combined Authority and chair of the M9 group of mayors. And I think it's Tim coming on rather than, or Euan Hudspeth, the former leader of Oxfordshire, might also be online as well. And we have Simon Edwards, the Chief Executive of the County Council Network, Councillor Richard Clewer, leader of the adjoining, my next door neighbours at Wiltshire County Council, the Unitary Authority, and then finally Councillor Sam Chapman-Allen, who's chair of the District Councils Network. So there I think we've got a very good representation of all the various tiers of local government. So if I move on then to ask our panel to address this, and I will first of all ask for Tim Bowles to say a few words to kick this discussion off.
Sorry, excuse me, Robert. Thank you very much indeed, and delighted to join you, and found the first session really interesting, and really pleased to see arguably one of the UK's best metro mayors in Ben joining us. He's done a brilliant job up there and is a great advocate for what I believe is the right and sensible way to see combined authorities prosper. But I'm mindful that this session is about defining the tiers and responsibilities of local government. So I'd just say to everybody, my background is I was a councillor for many years, both at very, very local level and at unitary level. And as Robert says, I was the first Metro Mayor of the Combined Authority in the West of England. The West of England, for anybody who isn't familiar with their geography, encompasses what's a city region encompassing Bristol and Bath and its surrounding natural economic areas. So I'd like to pick up a few points, if I may, and try and stick as much as I can to the topic heading, but perhaps provoke some thoughts. And I think the first one is going to be around the old adage that we as Metro Mayors had both in the run up to 2017 when this first tranche came into being, but also something that we still say when we talk to people around the world. And that's around how the UK is generally recognised as one of the most centralised forms of government. However, we have an absolute myriad, a myriad that's most people don't understand or appreciate, of other levels and tiers of government and of other quangos and organisations who are all involved in what, as we're talking about levelling up, I think is going to be relevant to the bigger picture and the discussions that we've got. So we're familiar with different tiers of government. We know we've got combined local government. We know we've got combined authorities. We have LEPs, we have city deals. We have powerhouses, and we've got a myriad, as I said earlier, of quangos. And I think somebody touched on it, one of the earlier chaps. And I think one of the biggest challenges we all face here is trying to get people to overcome historic thinking. I grew up in Somerset, and the county boundaries in Somerset, I think, were drawn in 1400s. But we're still trying to operate a local government model there on those boundaries. They don't reflect in any way the points that Ben was talking about, which is around functional economic geography. I loved Sir Robert's term of being a Heseltine. I thought it was great. I scribbled that one down and we'll remember it. Ben, myself and other Metro Mayors spent quite a lot of time working with Michael Heseltine around the challenges. And one of the questions he always asked me whenever I sat down with him over a cup of coffee privately was, where I live, there was once a sort of uber authority called Avon. And to this day, Michael Heseltine keeps saying, Tim, why did that never work? And the answer I always give him is because those responsibilities weren't really clear. The councils felt as though they were being usurped, and you had politicians fighting amongst themselves as you had officers fighting one another. Long and short of it is nobody was actually in it for the greater good or the bigger picture, because those responsibilities were not clearly defined. I passionately believe that devolution works as long as we're all clear about who does what. And when I was in charge of my combined authority, I was able to get an awful lot done by working with my council leaders in the same way Ben does, about showing how by working together, we can come together and attract. And I had an authority, by the way, that had a Labour authority, a Lib Dem authority, one Conservative, and one rainbow coalition of every political colour under the sun, excluding blue. So now it is possible to work cross-party as long as you're clear and defined what those greater good pieces are. Going back quickly to levelling up, I absolutely agree with everybody who was talking about this can't just be about the North. This has got to be about the ability for us to make good business cases to government. Totally agree on the points that were being made about not having to bid into funds. We have to be given some autonomy and responsibility, but with that comes accountability. And if we do that in the way that Ben was doing, and I'd like to think I was doing, you can show to government at those reviews why they should be backing and supporting you. So I'd be really interested in trying to think about how we overcome those old historic boundaries, how we try to come together in areas, whether they are uber rural or city-based, and it can happen because combined authorities as exist are not only about cities. Ben explained his scenario, Cambridge and Peterborough. Again, hardly has a core city. So it is possible to do things. And how we then in government address those challenges about all these other myriads of different levels of self-interest. So really interested in getting involved in the debate. Thanks for joining, and really looking forward to some questions and hopefully contributing a bit more. Thanks a lot, Robert.
Well, Tim, thank you very much indeed. And just by way of update, I think I mentioned the Chief Executive of the County Councils Network. In fact, we're joined by Councillor Tim Oliver, the Chair of the County Councils Network, and my friend Ian Hudspeth is going to be in our final panel. So I'll ask Councillor Oliver now to say a few remarks as part of the panel. Tim.
Thank you very much, Robert. Yes, I'm Tim Oliver. I'm the Chair of the County Councils Network, and I'm the leader of Surrey County Council. So the County Councils Network, for those of you that aren't that familiar with it, represents some of the largest councils in the country, 23 county councils, 13 unitary councils, and that's represents about 26 million residents in and across England. I think it'd be really interesting listening to the conversation. I mean, I think we all do, but we need to remind ourselves that this is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, and you know, our roles within local government is all about improving outcomes for residents. So the structural stuff should be secondary, absolutely secondary to how we can better deliver those improved outcomes. And I think for the county councils, you know, apart from all of the usual business as usual, you know, we've got 4 big areas at the moment that we need to concentrate on. It's about rebuilding and re-energising our local communities so that everyone can benefit. It's delivering the health and well-being agenda, you know, addressing inequality of opportunity, inequality of life expectancy, and driving through the implementation of the Health and Care Bill around integration of health and social care. It's enabling a greener future, you know, addressing housing issues and transport and net zero carbon. And the last thing is about empowering and engaging with our communities and building on what we've seen during the pandemic. So for me, it's absolutely right that the government needs to give local leaders and local authorities the tools to enable us to get on and do that. But you know, in terms of the definition of levelling up, I mean, you know, I think somebody said it earlier, every single person, every single area does have deprivation, including Surrey. You know, and for me, levelling up is about making sure in our communities that no one is left behind. This is about the individuals and not about a geographical conversation. So for local leaders do know their areas the best. You know, devolving and decentralising power will enable us to take those decisions in the right place at the right time and for the right people. You know, we are very centralised here. 2/3 of England do not have any devolution deal, and I know the government has set a target of 2030 for anybody that wants it. I hope that's accelerated. The conversations are progressing now at some speed around the county deals and the combined county authorities, and I think that's really good news. So you know, that is about, I think, simplifying the process, speeding up the decision-making process. You know, and for our residents, they don't really understand or need to understand necessarily the 3 different tiers of local government. You know, they want their bins collected, they want their planning application, and they want their children educated. You know, they want highways in good condition and so on. So if there are ways of making that happen quicker and faster and making the public pound go further, then I think that has got to be good news. So for me, you know, the Levelling Up Bill is a good opportunity now to drive that agenda forward, accepting that there will be differing views on the structure and you know, how best to proceed with that. And I'm sure we'll talk about the Merrell model a little bit down the line. But you know, certainly the CCN is very supportive of the direction of travel and the intentions of the bill.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tim. And I think, you know, your focus on outcomes rather than structures and you know, the politician's view as opposed to the public view, I think is a really important reminder of why we're here, what we're trying to do, and what those outcomes should be. So thank you for that. I'm going to now ask Richard Cllr, the leader of Wiltshire Unitary Authority, to say a few remarks. As I say, I'm his next door neighbour in Swindon, but we won't hold that against you, Richard. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, trying not to talk about sort of neighbouring tensions. I think it's probably worth, when you're looking at Unitary, starting with the difference that there is between Unitaries and the sort of counties and the combined authorities that we've been talking about. Unitary Council, fundamentally, whether you're looking at a large Unitary like Cornwall or Wiltshire, or some of the smaller Unitaries that exist down at the sort of 200,000 resident level of Swindon or something, we are fundamentally deliverers of adult social care with a lot of other responsibility tacked on. County councils are almost entirely deliverers of adult social care with some highways and economic development tacked on. The bit that is different when it comes to Unitaries is that we've also then got responsibility for, in particular, planning. And the responsibility both for development management, but then also the more complex issues that go with that around the creation of local plans and trying to sort of set the strategic direction for areas. I think just coming back to the social care context, it's worth bearing in mind that I mean, my social care budget, if you take children and adults together, is somewhere around 60% of the council budget. You can cut it in different ways. It creeps up to in excess of 80%. For some authorities, so it is very much a dominating factor. But the combination of planning, particularly when you look at a large unitary authority, if you're looking at trying to plan for an area the size of Wiltshire without Swindon, it's a really complex issue, fitting planning into that and dealing with the complexities that come with planning. And also then you're talking earlier about the idea of a single community and a single economy. I'm not sure that any county, possibly Cornwall, has a single identity. I don't think it's got single communities. Talking to Linda at the LGA conference there, and certainly single economies are very hard to define. The economy where I'm sitting right on the edge of the New Forest is very different to the economy in Royal Wood and Bassett on the edge of Swindon. I think some other issues that I would raise when we're considering devolution. I will touch briefly on the Merrell system. I think the Merrell model works very well in urban areas. I think it's a uniquely poor way of trying to address governance in large rural ones. We have enough problems with police and crime commissioners and people turning out to vote for those. If I look, and I apologise, but I'm not going to be particularly kind about the way the West of England authority is working at the moment. If I look there, Bristol has just decided to get rid of its mayor, and you have currently 2 Labour mayors there who can't seem to agree on anything, which from everything I'm hearing from my neighbours is causing paralysis. The idea of taking an area involving several different authorities that end up being of different political persuasions and then having a mayor elected who may belong to other yet another political persuasion, it's a recipe for a lack of trust. And I think going back to that unitary point, unitaries themselves, large unitaries, have a risk around democratic trust. I was a district councillor when I was first elected. People sort of trusted the district. When a unitary came in, there's this feeling of it's all a bit separate, it's all a bit distant. And I think the risk is that only gets worse in large geographic areas where you're then looking at democratically elected mayors. I think, as Tim had said, there are some huge potential benefits. If you look at the responsibility that we have with things like the integrated care system, where we are, because of the social care work, incredibly enmeshed with with integrated care and with making that work. If you look at the way that planning works as well, and the use and definition of place and the work that can be done around place, there are some huge synergies that could work. Tier 1 devolution makes no sense to a place like Wiltshire, to a large unitary. We've already got it. And the fact that we are not being offered tier 3 unless we take a Merrell model that doesn't seem to fit from any of the residents, any of the parish councils, any of the councillors I've talked to, our sort of way of life is a bit frustrating when we look at the process at the moment, and causes certainly some unitary authorities serious thought.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for that rather, I thought, frank and unalloyed and balanced analysis of your very own situation as leader of a unitary authority, and the danger of becoming so big and distant that you suddenly lose that sense of accountability and connection with your local population. But at the same time, the difficulty about being too small sometimes, which can really be a problem, particularly from a strategic planning point of view. But thank you very much indeed for that. Now, the last member of our second panel is the chair of the District Councils Network, and that's Councillor Sam Chapman-Allen. So I'll ask Sam to say a few words to us before we look at some of the questions that have been submitted. Sam.
Lovely, thanks, Sir Robert, and good afternoon, everyone. And well, I'm sort of last man standing here, so I'll try and summarise where we are. So the District Councils Network represents much the same geography as you heard from Tim earlier from the CCN. So just short of that, 22 million people across the country, some 40% of England's population, that's 68% of the country is covered by district councils. So if you look at the services everybody in local government provides, some 137 district councils provide 86 of those. And for those who are within the M25 and have probably never come across a two-tier area, as you've heard Richard earlier, the county councils look after roads and some infrastructure, adults and children's, and the district councils look after other activities such as housing, planning, leisure, revs and bends, regeneration. And people are sometimes taken aback that a district council representing between 100 and up to 145,000 residents is in that space around regeneration, and we absolutely are. And over the last 3 years, little district councils have delivered over £1.3 billion worth of investment and regeneration in every single one of our communities. How are we able to achieve that? Because it's about localism, and district councillors represent on average about 2,500 residents compared to those at unitaries and county councils as it goes up to 7,500 to 10,000. Why is that important? Because it's around community. The Levelling Up white paper isn't around me going toe to toe with Richard and Tim around governance and restructuring our organisations, because each one of us does a really important job and a role. This is around us understanding those local economies, those local communities, those challenges, but also those opportunities, whilst in turn supporting our colleagues at the county council around that wider infrastructure, that wider transport integration, that wider education provision, adults and children's, while allowing us locally to deliver for our residents and communities. Now, I welcome the Levelling Up white paper, much the same as Richard and Tim does, because I think it's, for the first time ever, sets out a really clear framework for us to engage with government. But I think we've heard across our previous speakers today that actually one size doesn't fit all, that actually we need to determine what that looks and feels like in every single locality across the country to deliver both for our residents and businesses alike. So it is around that localism, it is around that accountability, it is around delivering, but more importantly, it's around understanding. We all got involved, regardless whether you're in Westminster or in local government, you got involved to make a difference for the communities you live in, your family live in, your friends live in. And I think that there is a perception sometimes within Westminster and or Whitehall that this perverse view that local councillors are not willing to engage in conversations around what things may look like, what can devolvement actually be like. And actually, I think the most exciting part of where we are today is how excited and buoyed up colleagues across the country are about what devolution could really look like. But in turn, as Tim said earlier, it's not necessarily more about the governance structure to date. That can follow suit. We've proven over 2 years that colleagues across local government can work collaboratively to deliver at pace, to protect communities and businesses. We've got to make sure that we're getting those right powers devolved for our localities in that piecemeal. And we've got to make sure that Treasury understands that grip of expenditure can be passed and ported down to local authorities and or a MCA or a CCA, that Whitehall doesn't have to feel that we're taking away those powers and functions from them, that Westminster doesn't have to be concerned that there may be a bigger accountable local individual, that actually all of us are there to get the best results for our communities. And for the first time since 1970, you heard earlier that the Heseltine piece, for the first time ever, we've got a really clear framework and position for all of us across local government and or interested parties to engage positively to get the best results for our communities. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sam. And as this conversation has gone on, I can see in the thread some really interesting discussions about committee model versus cabinet leader model. It's tempting to go, I'm not going to say it's a rabbit hole, because it isn't, because this is all about the accountability question that we've asked ourselves. And I suppose, having had my own experience as a county councillor with a committee model, I can, wax lyrical about the drawbacks of the lack of frequency within which the committee model was actually able to engage with officers and really hold people to account. And it's that level of intensity and frequency that does in many ways commend the cabinet model as an alternative and better way of doing things. However, the price is very often the backbench councillor will feel rather marginalised and not part of the central decision making. And therefore, there are questions, I think, that I'm sure we can develop in the margins of these discussions about how it is that we genuinely engage all councillors, all elected councillors in that sense of responsibility for the actions of their local authority. Now, some of the questions that were submitted before the meeting, some interesting ones about the question of consent. Are these things just too often done unto us? Local government reorganisation, is it too top down? And then the second and perhaps more important question is, is all this extra devolution actually a reverse devolution? Is it actually a ceding of powers from the grassroots up to the sub-regional or regional level? And is that something that is perhaps upsetting the balance? And I do think that for our panel, it's probably worth them making comments and thinking about that, and in particular about the bold question: how many tiers are needed? Is one tier enough? Is the status quo enough? Is this sort of mosaic of contradictions where we need to be, or can we impose some sort of more rational approach to all of this? Now, I think there's plenty there for panel members to further comment on, and I would welcome them to contribute. Who'd like to go first? Got a hand up from Tim. Over to you.
Thanks, Robert. I think just to be clear on the consent issue, because I know that has been confusing for people. And Neil O'Brien, the Minister, has clarified that, I think, hopefully to everybody's satisfaction, which is that in a CCA model, a combined county authority model, i.e. two county councils or two upper tier authorities coming together, under section 16 of the bill, it's an enabling piece of legislation. So if the district or borough councils wish to engage with that CCA in areas where they have specific responsibility, then that enables them to do it. But the Minister has been very, very clear, both in committee stage and in writing, that this is a flow down rather than a flow up. This isn't a reorganisation of local government. So I don't think anybody needs to have any concern about the consent issue. I think, on the sort of second point about reverse devolution, many of the powers, particularly at level 2, are enhancements of the existing responsibilities of upper tier authorities, so adult education and so on. Probably one of the biggest changes is the relationship with the LEPs and how that would work going forward, because that looks as if the government wishes to sort of transfer those powers from the LEPs into the county authorities. So I don't think there's nothing in the bill that in any way impacts on the sovereignty of the district and boroughs. And as Sam has said, there's been some very good two-tier working or three-tier working in some areas throughout the pandemic. And I think that's what we need to do. The combined authority model hasn't really worked historically. I think there have been challenges where you have a single vote for all of the members of that authority. So a county council, in my case, I have a budget of £1.5 billion. I have a district council that has a budget of 30 million. So it just doesn't really work to have both having the same single vote. So I don't think there's anything in the proposals here that have a negative impact at the district or borough level. and very much I see this as those powers coming down to enable us to sort of get on and to do things. So for me, that's it is definitely a top down rather than a bottom up.
And thank you very much indeed, Tim, for reminding us about what Neil O'Brien, my former parliamentary private secretary and now rising star, is talking about. And I think we're lucky to have him as Minister, bearing in mind his commitment to the levelling up agenda. Sam, I think, wanted to come in next, and then I'll bring in Richard and then Tim Bowles to round up. Sam.
Yeah, great, thanks. So the challenge we face, and colleagues will be aware, is that we've got a different dichotomy across the country with those shire communities. So in some localities, we have both a county council and a unitary authority able to form that CCA in the emerging framework. And for localities such as I am in Norfolk, we have no unitary council. We have that single county council authority. Now, Tim's absolutely right that Neil O'Brien has through the bill reading stage expanded on clause 16 and what that looks like. However, there is still that risk and perception that for those authorities who are not forthcoming to want to engage in that process, that actually those powers can be elevated up against their will. Now, what does that actually mean in the grand sense of things? So me in Norfolk County Council is an immensely successful council, but actually you've heard from Richard and Tim that 60 to 80% of their budget goes on adults and children's, which is a really important element of society. But in turn, if we look back to our previous speakers, levelling up is around that place-based shaping, that accountability, that regeneration, that forming new homes, that planning reform, everything which we require, at the risk of what? So we have to make sure that the tiers we're creating and that structure isn't to the detriment, because there is no new money. There is only taxpayers' money. We can't generate money. You heard that from Ben earlier. Some localities are stagnated at that ability to create money. So that has to come from the taxpayer themselves. And therefore, we've got to make sure we get the biggest bang for our buck. And if you look through the framework itself, under that 1, 2, and 3, some of those skills are really set around investment spending. The government has recognised that district councils are well placed to get the biggest bang for the buck and get that to where it's needed most. And that's why UK SPF has moved to districts around that local infrastructure and decision making, around brownfield purchasing, around the relationship with Homes England. All of those functions sit at a district level. Then, of course, we move into that space and place around what does the PCC look like and whether that sits into a CCA. So at no point are district councils sat here saying that we are the poor relation. District councils are really excited and buoyed up by the challenge and the opportunities presented through the white paper. But in turn, they want to make sure that their powers they have, whether that's planning, housing, whatever it may be, relationship with businesses, are brought to those tables of CCAs, MCAs, so we get the best results at the quickest time possible. And Tim's absolutely right. I have no right to vote on adults and children's, but in turn, county council shouldn't necessarily have the ability to vote on planning and or housing and homelessness, because that's our statutory function. But I think it's all about those local decisions, colleagues on this call, that we can find the best solution in every single one of our localities to support that around single community and single economy.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sam. I think that was an impassioned plea there for making sure that the grassroots is absolutely reflecting the aspirations of local communities are balanced here. I think Richard wanted to come in. Richard Cllr.
Yes, thanks. I think you could probably write a doctoral thesis on the question you've asked here, but I'll try and be succinct, and I will try and be blunt as well. I think when you're looking at the idea of devolution, and having sat on a district council, as I said, I think it's probably fair to say that the further down you get in the tiers of government, the more parochial people get. If you look at parish councils, my parish councils, even the bigger ones inside Wiltshire, tend to be pretty parochial. At the district level, it was relatively parochial and perhaps not strategic enough, whereas you get more strategic thinking the further up you go because of the scale that you're looking at. Consent, however, makes this really tricky. I've been speaking to various neighbours. If I look at my neighbours in Hampshire, there are some who feel very threatened with the potential concept of looming unitary, as they see it, or the threat of that will come through devolution, and the fact that they don't have vast amounts in common with, say, Portsmouth or Southampton. I think the same would be said if you look at a unitary in West Berkshire that's concerned about Reading and in particular Slough, and the idea of being financially tied in an authority that has anything to do with Slough clearly causes a great deal of concern at the moment. So I wonder if there is something in around the element of consent where we need to be looking at not necessarily what a functional economy is, because it's too hard to define in rural areas, but a functional economic system. My area comprises 18 market towns. Dorset, as the unitary authority, not the county, is just market towns. Somerset market towns. Swindon, who we're talking with about combined authorities, is a larger urban area with villages around it. Making that complexity work without force fitting simply a county boundary model, I think is a real challenge. And I think it goes further. If you look at the requirement, if you are going to go with a combined authority, to have a clear decision-making structure, and if I take the Wiltshire-Swindon example, Wiltshire has twice the population of Swindon. My chief exec will without doubt say, well, we've got twice the population, you can't have an equal vote if you're looking at combined areas. Yet there's no way Swindon's going to walk into something that basically means they do as Wiltshire says. So finding that balance and finding something that means that we can, outside of the more tightly defined large metropolitan areas, find a balance where people are willing to give their consent because they're working with people who aren't looking to dominate, but are looking to engage as equal partners with relatively similar structural issues. I think is the real crux of this once you get in to rural areas. There are some huge wins that we could get out of this. Tourism, for me, the idea of using Wessex for tourism rather than just Wiltshire is great. But then if you look at transport, rural transport it's an aspiration. It's not a reality for most of our villages. And the powers that come with devolution around rural transport could be really critical about making that work. So I think my answer to the question is it really does depend where you sit on what you're trying to achieve. And one size doesn't fit all, and government do need to, if they're going to go for devolution, that means it's going to be messy and they're going to have to give up a little more, perhaps a little more than at the moment Michael Gove would like to.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Richard, for your frankness, and you're absolutely right about Swindon, by the way. And I think your last remark about what Michael Gove or the Secretary of State's aspirations might be, I think we again a very welcome injection of realism there. I don't know whether Tim Bowes wants to come back in just to. We're coming now fast to the end of this second session. So Tim, I'd like your reflections as to this, and also finally, really, are we actually talking about the right thing here? We could end up just getting ourselves into a complete tiz about levels of government, layers of government. Coming back to Tim Oliver's point, isn't this all about outcomes? And if so, why are we talking about this at all?
Thank you, Robert. Yes, please. I'd appreciate a couple of minutes. The questions I think you posed us in this last round were the ones I've written down. Is consent was mentioned, but I think that was largely resolved. So I won't dwell on that. But I think your exam question to us was how many tiers are needed, and can we impose a more rational system? So I'm going to take the first, beg your pardon, the second one first. Yes, we must look at a more rational way of doing things. And the reason being is we wouldn't be having this conversation, and levelling up would not be an issue if the current structures and systems were as effective as everyone would like them to be. So that's why I said at the start, I think we need a very open and honest conversation here, where we overcome individual preferences, individual interests, to try and find out what is the right way to do different things. Now, from my experience, we've heard people here talk about transport. That has to be done on a regional stroke subnational basis. And people are trying to do that. We were working with Swindon and Wiltshire on the subnational transport in the same way that we were running down to Dorset and the south coast and further down. Then within the region that I was responsible for, we knew very much what the impact on the congestion that we had was costing our economy, both in terms of jobs and outcomes. So those are things that have to cross borders. So to me, things like jobs, things like transport, things like skills, those are the things we should be looking at on that larger scale, because those reflect how we live and work nowadays as individuals. When it comes down to some of those focuses within the white paper, of which there are those 4 areas, bearing in mind it's boost productivity, spread opportunities, restore sense of community, empower leaders. There are clearly elements within that, within the white paper, that should be owned and delivered by, it's not a hierarchy of tiers, but by other aspects of local government, stroke central government. But from my perspective, and the point I was been trying to make, is we need to be very clear about not what the objectives are and what outcomes we need, and then match that to the right form of government. Not say, one of us is involved in this, another's involved in that, and somebody else is in there. How can we make sure we keep everybody happy all the time? My experience in life is you can never do that. So to take your point, I think we need to have a far more rational discussion about how we deliver those outcomes which everybody's agreed on. And we shouldn't be having the conversation if we don't passionately believe that we need some change in how we do this. Otherwise, the government won't be having the conversation. Hope that helps. We'll mindful of time, so we'll wrap up there, Robert. Thank you.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed, Tim, for bringing us back to the why as opposed to the what. And, you know, just finishing up on this session, I think some of the chat has been interesting. I think Liam's point at the beginning, and one of his questions that he submitted, was about the blurring of lines and how that can lead to decreased accountability and duplication of effort. And, you know, that's an important point as well, whereas, you know, it's tempting to blur the lines. Sometimes that can lead to unfairnesses and a lack of clarity about who is accountable. So look, thank you very much indeed to our second panel. Really powerful contributions there from people who have a wealth of experience in local government, and I'm hugely grateful to them. I'll now move on, with about just half an hour left in our 2-hour session, to the final panel, which is going to be discussing understanding how the government can give local and regional communities a say. And I make no apology for the fact that some of the issues have bled into each other, inevitable in a lively discussion like this. We are joined by, as I say, a fresh panel. It's my pleasure to welcome Euan Hudspeth, the former leader of Oxfordshire County Council, and also joining him is Sir Merrick Cockell, chair of Localis and former chair, of course, of the LGA itself, with great experience in local government, and indeed we are grateful to have him. And then finally, Councillor Euan Jardine, who is the Conservative group leader of the Scottish Borders Council. Again, really good to have Euan on board, bearing in mind the different model that involves, not just in terms of its electoral system for those anoraks like me who love following Scottish elections, but also the powers and the responsibilities it has. And having Euan on, the relationship that they have, which can be somewhat troubled, shall we say, with Holyrood, and how the devolved nations themselves have, certainly from my Welsh experience, a bit of a centrifugal pull sometimes to assume more power, whether it's Cardiff, Edinburgh, or Edinburgh, indeed Belfast as well. So I'm going to ask Euan to kick off this panel discussion. Over to you, Euan.
Thank you very much, Sir Robert. It's great to be able to take part in this debate. And like everything, when you come towards the end, you've picked up points along the way and you think, oh, I need to sort of get involved in that. And one of the key things that's coming across is we're discussing areas and the functionality of areas. And for me, working in Oxfordshire, we were part of what was the Oxford to Cambridge arc, which was government trying to impose an area which, yes, it's a good driving force of the UK economy, but actually, when we first got in the room years ago, there was about 34 different leaders and organisations represented. So I can understand why governments wants a sort of single point of contact, whether that be a mayor or whatever, because actually it was very difficult for that particular organisation to reach a decision. And of course, now that's sort of dissipated a little bit. So we've heard about functionality area and regions, and I think that's so important to have that functionality, because interestingly enough, one of the key areas we worked with was Swindon through the England's economic heartland, which actually was an organic growth of areas where we came together as originally 3 county councils working together, and actually grew right with Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire all joining in. So that's my bit of the side that I just sort of, I can understand where government wants to come to this single point of contact, but it's at what level do you put that single point of contact to make it so big an area that the ARC was, people couldn't understand. It's interesting to hear that combined authorities have that power and autonomy, which I think is what we all really strive for in whatever's devolution downwards. And if we're not going to go for a combined authority model, what government needs to have in local government is, and I hesitate to use this word today, but need to trust local government to be able to sort of deliver and actually make sure that those plans are in place. Because again, Tony, I think it was mentioned earlier about the different bidding pots, and it's really infuriating in local government where we're putting in bids all the time for various pots of money, and what happens is the officers then become very risk adverse. And they do have a conversation with central government about, oh, if you put this in, you won't get your bid. If you put this, so take it out. Well, actually, why do people in the Treasury and SW1 have better knowledge of local areas? So government really need to trust local government to be able to deliver. And there's always going to be some outriders that are always going to get people who turn around and say, oh, well, you wouldn't want to work with, and we named a few already. And this levelling up agenda is not about levelling down. And despite what will happen over the coming years, and perhaps the ARC region is not going to see the funding that was once promised, but that area, that region individually will still grow. So actually levelling up is about levelling up continually, because the goalposts are always moving with those areas. So it comes back to, what can local government do? I think local government has to be more ambitious. And it's not just about the traditional infrastructure, because surely the ultimate outcome has got to be that to make sure that all our residents can reach their full potential. So how do we incorporate that with education and particularly health outcomes? Because we know local government has the tools and the planning powers to actually make sure that homes are good and safe and secure, and particularly not damp, which then improves the health outcomes. So perhaps local government should be more ambitious, whatever area is determined, to actually incorporate health into that, because actually the biggest savings to the national purse are in the health sector. And if we could only just understand what we could do and invest money upstream to prevent people getting into having poorer health outcomes, then actually the saving to all of us would be so good. So summing up, it's just, let's make sure we're reaching the full potential of all our residents. But government has trust in local government, and then local governments be ambitious with designs and make sure they deliver those policies for residents. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ian. And I think your call to arms on health, I think, is a very interesting one. You know, I'm fairly young, but there was a time when, of course, local government had a very key role in health commissioning, right up to the 70s, well, up to the early 80s, in fact. And you know, sometimes nothing's new under the sun is what is coming to my mind. So a really good opener there. It's my pleasure now to ask Merrick Cockell to address us. So Merrick, it's great to see you, and looking forward to your contribution.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you for inviting me. I think you became a councillor in about 1993, something around that. I was a few years before you, 1986. But I think, and there's some other similar vintage councillors I can see on the call, or former councillors. I think what we've seen over those many years are lots of initiatives, often with very buzzy names, that are committed to improving the life chances of individuals and communities to the level of more advantaged areas. And having said that, I think it would be too easy and rather unnecessary to be too disappointed by the Levelling Up paper, or indeed to focus too much on the past. Your commentary, Robert, on the paper, I think fairly balances the positive, but also some areas that are disappointing. And certainly throughout my political life, there was always an expectation that the Conservative government with a large majority would finally be able to reform local government, and sadly that opportunity's been lost. And certainly 30 years a councillor, I still believe that we need to fundamentally, and government needs to lead that process. Later on, I'm sure we've got some interesting questions on giving local and regional communities a say. So I'm not going to really talk about that, but I thought I'd just comment on some of the opportunities and risks. The difficulty, of course, with levelling up, and we've heard a bit of it today, is behind the noble and underlying the noble aspirations, rather like big society, it's pretty hard to define. It could be almost anything you want it to be, and it risks becoming a sort of a rag bag, a safe place to put all the past failings and all the areas that we failed to change and improve in the past. And let's be honest about it. And we live in pretty, and Robert, you know better than any of us, some pretty difficult times, political times at the moment. And certainly there's never going to be, and there's not enough money now. And indeed, there's not enough time, because we've got to see some results from levelling up, to think that levelling up is a cure-all for all past ills, and that every village, every town, every region, every city can be levelled up in short order. My hope, though, with the white paper and the initiative behind it, is that it could be the mechanism by which we prevent or avoid future problems that otherwise are going to hit us. And I said it would be too easy to focus on the historic, but of course many of those problems that have been identified are pretty intractable problems. If they weren't, they would have frankly been solved in the past. And we will miss the opportunities that are coming if we let the future problems become intractable by ignoring them or focusing only on the past. So I'm just going to talk about a very few examples that are heading our way that we need to be thinking about now. And consciously, I haven't looked at things like climate change, because they're just a given. But and some of this came up at the LGA conference last week. But one area that is not new, but it's going to become increasingly important, and that's power generation and storage. We know this is going to be literally far more visible as the grid becomes more reliant on smaller intermittent wind and solar generation. I think there's a piece of work in America has worked out that it's going to take 4 times as much land, physical land, to produce the same amount of power that the grid currently produces. And of course, local government in many areas is still a large landowner, and indeed power is needed by every part, every region, every area that needs to be leveled up or kept successful. And I think there's a question for local government: should it be about true accountability for that power, which our lives are going to become ever dependent on it, or could we go back? Could we become far more proactive in the ownership or the commissioning of that power generation and storage? That's one. The second one is urban ageing. I say that as somebody who is rapidly doing that. We all know about the ageing society. There's nothing particularly surprising about that. But what we are now seeing, I think, is that in the coming years, there's going to be a rise in areas that haven't been really associated with older people. And that's particularly true in inner cities. Pensioner poverty is now higher in London than in other regions, at about 19% versus 14% average in the rest of the country. In London, there are 1.1 million Londoners who are over 65. That's going to rise to over 2 million by 2050. We can see and think about the practical impacts of that, and the provision of care and all those traditional local government and care elements that local government is easily familiar with. But actually, we're going to see other things: increased loneliness. We're going to see higher levels of mental health, both of which we, of course, have seen increased levels of through the pandemics, of people living alone, and indeed a much more diverse older generation. Again, here's a problem that it's coming. It's not a prediction. It's not a guess. It's there. It's coming our way, and we need to be thinking about it before it becomes one of those intractable problems that we admit to having failed to deal with effectively. And the third one is something really I've only just heard about very recently and have been very intrigued by it, and that is the opportunity for local government, and it might be part of the answer indeed, to engaging with communities. And it's something called digital twinning, and it came out of it's coming out of the aerospace industry, where you no longer actually have to take an aircraft, take it out of use, and actually physically look at the engines. You can monitor the state of the engines without the need for physical inspections. There's a town in Germany called Herrenberg, which is piloting a digital twin of itself. Literally, it is a digital model of itself, and that allows it to model the impact of new policies, which could be everything from traffic flows to a new shopping centre and other practical, but also social changes. And they say it would, and they're showing the evidence already, that it allows them to visualise through the use of city data and citizens' responses, and indeed involve them better in and earlier in decision taking. You don't have to make a decision and then see what happens. You can actually see the likely impact of it before you take that decision, and what the impact will be via your digital twin of yourself. Now, I've probably lost half the audience, and you probably think I've lost the plot a bit here. But as we know with technologies, and you don't have to think back 30 years or 35 years to when I started being councillor, just think how the world was very different 10 years ago. These sort of uses of data are coming our way. They're going to happen, but we have to think about and capture them now, so that we can help to involve individuals and communities to take better decisions and to focus investment, and not, as we've had to do in the past, where we've had to try a whole variety of initiatives and some have worked and some haven't. I think these sort of initiatives will show ways where we can test it without actually having to have spent the money first. Thank you.
Well, Merrick, thank you very much indeed for a very thought-provoking contribution. I think you picking on energy generation, the aging population and diversity does echo, I think, some of the questions that we've already received on some of those issues. And your digital twinning point, I think I'm fascinated by that. I really think that is a very innovative and sensible way for hard-pressed local authorities without much capacity to do some modelling, as you say, to work out the true impact of their policies. And Liam's come in with a point about fat busting in Tameside, £2,000 a head. It doesn't seem to me to be very, very good value for money with these top-down, well-intentioned but poorly targeted schemes. Really thought-provoking. My pleasure now to ask Euan Jardine, the group leader in Scottish Borders, to address us. Euan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sir Robert, and apologies if I break off halfway through coughing. I'm still in the middle of a COVID, so my throat's a wee bit croaky now and again. But thank you, and I felt a bit like a duck out of water this morning, obviously being from Scotland, and this is very much England's council and some of the discussions that are ongoing, but it's interesting to hear how some of the dynamics mix in. I think the community engagement piece, to me, that's really important. So Scotland as a sector, so the SNP, the central government here, the Holyrood, have got a real feel that they don't like local government. So they're doing their best to break up local government. So we're just talking about health and social care. Well, they've now introduced the National Care Service, where they want to take care out of social care out of local government. Then they're going to come down the line and take education out of local government, which leaves us not much to do in local government. So it's a real serious problem here. How do we empower local government and keep it actually relevant in the conversation? And for me, community engagement is one of the main parts here. And I like how that's one of the topics here. And I've actually, not just a group leader, I recently became the leader of Scottish Borders Council. So I became the leader, and what I've decided to do is go around every single ward in the community conversations on a tour. Apparently the first council leader to ever do so, and to hear what the community want to say, what the community are wanting to tell us. Because as a council, the one thing I've felt as a council for 5 years, you get told there is no community engagement. The council is constantly getting negative press, negative. You don't agree with it. So if they're building a new school, they'll dig the holes in the park, tell nobody why they're digging the holes in the park, and then all of a sudden say, oh, by the way, we're putting a new school here, no consultation, things like that. And it's doing everything backwards. And I think that's the real problem with local government, is we just don't reach out to the people enough. And somebody mentioned there about the trust between government and local government, but I think sometimes local government needs to trust actually the communities to go forward and do things on their own. And that's, so I think trust is the main word. So we've got a thing of, I've mentioned I don't trust Holyrood, so I don't trust Holyrood, then local government, then, so it's this word trust. I think that needs to filter through everywhere. In the UK government, it actually doesn't come into any conversations in Scotland. The only times it starts to come into conversations is here, the Levelling Up Fund, etc. And then we still feel when it comes in that it's thrown upon us. So the discussions are, we're having to make snap decisions on what we want, what projects, how do we put the projects together, and then we get all excited, oh, we might get this, and then to be told, oh, you're not going to get it at all, you didn't get past the round. And it's this clarity, and people, again, so they don't invest in levelling up or don't think about it because they think they're not going to get it, or they don't see the priorities for it. And also, I think it was a community enhancement fund. We just got a new 3G pitch in Galashiels, where I'm from, and that came from this UK government funding. However, that went through Scottish Football Association, so nobody knew it was coming through UK government. So I think UK government needs to do a good bit of selling itself in Scotland to show the benefits it's given to communities. And I don't think it does a good way. And we have obviously saw the past few days, Nicola Sturgeon up here is wanting to rip the UK apart again. And the only way to kind of stop that is, we can see the question, they always say, what does the UK government do for us? Well, we do all this. Yeah, prove it. Oh, well, and people, they're easy to say that we can't prove it because we're not forcing or showing it enough. And I think as a Conservative, it's really important that the narrative in Scotland is the UK government provides this and that, but we don't do it as enough. And we are very much, the Labour have taken over Holyrood as the second largest party. So we're getting pushed back again. So it's a hard battle being a Conservative in Scotland. I think there's only 4 or 3 leaders in Scotland, councils who are Conservative run. So for us, it's a conversation. So we need to be working with the UK government more, trusting them. I think trusting our communities. And for me, that's what it's empowering communities and giving them the say. And if we can give them the say, they can put the trust in us as Conservatives. I think, oh, they actually, as Conservatives, gave us the power and the trust. Oh, they're good. And then that's spiraled on. So the one word I would come back to on here in engagement communities is trust. So I'll end it there, but trust isn't the main thing. Thanks.
Euan, thank you very much. A really useful insight there, and very much echoes the challenges that I identified when I was on the Union subcommittee of Cabinet, which was all about trying to work out how the UK government could directly send its message to the communities of Scotland and Wales to make sure that people didn't think it was all Holyrood, it was all Cardiff, and the importance and relevance of national government. And I suppose, you know, using that as an example, that is an example of how a conversation between national government and communities has to happen, and therefore you know, we should be thinking from an English point of view. This is not a sort of luxury. This is something that has to happen. And therefore, having a conversation and you know, a direct sort of conversation with the national local government is something that isn't an optional extra. The question is how to do that. Some of the questions we've had, I think, have been really interesting. We've had a question echoing some of Merrick's points about intergenerational fairness, bearing in mind particularly in places like London, where you know, young people perhaps don't have circles outside of those cities and don't have the support in order to get on the property ladder. I think that's a really interesting challenging question. And then one from again, another Swindon colleague of mine, Councillor Basil Solomon, about increasing representation and levelling up for our Black and minority ethnic communities, bearing in mind the increasingly diverse communities which we all represent, including my own one in Swindon. And I think really the last question I have on my list here from Councillor George Smith is about the balance between the need to give people a say in the future of their community, but also the need to balance NIMBYism against that, whereas, you know, very often that is the default position. And I think it would be really good in the last few minutes that we have before 4 o'clock, just to hear from the panel some reflections as to the points we've heard, the different you know, reflections that I think local government needs to embody. I'm going to resist joining in with active support of Merrick's more radical viewpoint about the reorganisation of local government. I entirely agree with him, by the way. He's bang on right, but it's probably not, sadly today, the time to have this discussion. He's right to say that in 2019 we had a moment where we could have been radical, and that, I'm afraid, has passed. So really now it's all about making this work and trying to ensure that the aspirations of Michael Gove and his department actually do come true, and not just in England, but more widely across the United Kingdom. So I'll ask colleagues to come back in. Ian, I wonder if you want to come back in with any reflections as to not only what we've discussed, but also what we've seen in the chat, which I think has really emphasised the importance about trust, which does seem to be in short supply in various aspects of government at the moment. Ian.
Yes, thank you. I think that one of the things that came out in the chats was about the health outcomes and prevention, and actually it's a longer term. It's sort of, and it does have to be medium term, and of course it doesn't fit into the political cycle, because if I knock on a door and say to somebody, I'm going to spend all the money over there so that in 10 years time we're going to have a better, fitter society with reduced income taxation, the next councillor candidate comes along and says, I'm going to fix your pothole, make sure your bins are collected, you know, who's going to get the vote? And that is the really tricky thing. I'd like to thank Euan for saying, pointing out its trust is actually downwards as well as upwards. And I think that's something that I think is so important. But then it does come down to this point you made about the say in the community, because actually so often, and I started off life as a parish councillor, and I don't know how many thousands of parish councils I've been to. Unfortunately, parish councils aren't there to look at the bigger strategic picture, and that always gives that element of sort of a bit of NIMBYism in there, and they need to trust the strategic picture to get it right for that. But thank you very much. There's only a few minutes left, so thank you for that opportunity, Sir Robert.
Thank you very much indeed, and that's great to hear from you. Merrick, I wonder if you want to come back in with some further reflections developing upon the points that we've heard.
Thank you. I said, well, I think that there's been discussion, some of the questions sent in as well, about government consulting, a discussion between government and communities about the future of local and regional government. And at Localis, we've been doing some research to try and find out if there are actually any striking examples when a direct conversation between communities and central government has actually worked effectively, or indeed led to clear policy outcomes. And we're finding it's hard to be able to tie any examples of that down when national government tries to sort of go around local government and local communities and local structures and talk direct. Clearly, there are times when they do, and I think around some referenda and city mayors and things like that. But we know that there've been patchy results on some of that. Bristol being an obvious sort of very recent case where the people of Bristol decided actually they didn't want a single voice and a mayor anymore. So and the other thing on that, I think, is an inevitable sort of exhaustion by communities who are asked when it suits, and local government falls into this trap too. It consults, it asks demanding questions and real involvement with that community, and then the circus moves on, and those subjects, they never get any feedback and move on to something else, and inevitably feel exhausted by the wish to be endlessly consulted. So I think there's got to be sort of a seriousness about it and a respect for, and that applies from local to national to local, and indeed local to communities and individual citizens, about what true consultation involvement means, which just brings me to the NIMBYism point. Clearly there has to be a balance between the views of individual citizens and their ability to decide everything, because local government does have a couple of outstanding features, and two of them are that it's local and that it's government. And those of you, I'm no longer part of that group, but standing for elected office and taking all the brickbats and the responsibilities that go with that is truly important, because only you have truly a right to speak for your communities, and you've got to do that very carefully, and you've got to do that with great responsibility. But one of your responsibilities is to do what I was suggesting earlier, which is not just think about the past and deal with the day-to-day, what is on people's minds, quite rightly, of their lives here and now, but actually is to think 20 years ahead, or even longer than that, to the type of communities that you can have an impact, that you can help to influence now and help to create, and that they're healthy and they are affluent and they're all those well-educated and all those elements we can quote. So you've got to make that balance, and therefore it can't simply be people considering the here and now and their lives and what will inconvenience them. It's got to, you have the responsibility to look to the future and think what is the best for your communities.
Well, Merrick, I think that's a really excellent and eloquent way to round off the conversation today. I was particularly pleased on this panel to have Euan's perspective as well, because this is not an England-only issue. As you can tell, the tensions that Scottish colleagues feel and Welsh colleagues feel, indeed, who haven't been on the call, are very real when it comes to their own devolved governments. And therefore, I think bringing together different parts of the kingdom in this way has been extremely productive. And I think I take away from the overall discussion that we've had today a real sense that whilst processes and structures are important, it's actually the people that serve within them who are most important. And that without trust, without accountability, without, as Merrick says, a constant look ahead rather than an understandable obsession with the day-to-day and the reactive, which is an inevitable part of life in local government, and I know from my own experience, then we won't, I think, be able to really fulfil the agenda that's been set for us by government. I welcome today's discussion. I think it's been a really good springboard for further panels that we are going to hold as we gather evidence and prepare our submissions for what I hope will be an exciting and important contribution to this debate. Our next session will be held in the Midlands at Aldridge Brownhills at the end of this month, the 29th of July, which will be a hybrid session in person and online. And you and other colleagues will, of course, be more than welcome to join in to that as well. And as Ben says, a full transcript of today's discussion will be made available, forgive me, via YouTube. My thanks to Cllr and to the team for organising today's excellent session, to all our panellists for their contributions, and to all of you for making this a well-attended and lively afternoon. Thank you very much. See you again soon.
Thank you, Sir Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great to see everybody. Thank you all very much. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Robert.
Right.